So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's panel discussion on preventing data breaches. So my name's Tracey Long. I'm the Vice President of Programs for the PCI SSC. I have with me today 3 of our PFIs to share their insights from the trenches, so to say. So I have Chris Hague, who's the Divisional Head of Technical Services of Foregenix, Benn, the Managing Director of 3B Data Security, and Chris Novak, the Managing Director of Verizon Cybersecurity Consulting. Quite a few titles there, guys, quite a bit of breath to get through. So for us, PCI Forensic Investigators, so PFIs to shorten it, they help determine the occurrence of a cardholder data compromise and when and how it may have occurred. These PCI Forensic Investigators are qualified by the Council's programme, and they must work for a qualified security assessor company that provides a dedicated forensic investigation practice. They perform investigations within the financial industry using proven investigative methodologies and tools. The PFI programme represents the streamlining of requirements for forensic investigators and is intended to help simplify and expedite procedures and requirements for being qualified as engaging with forensic investigators. So you'll see on the screen we have Appendix A, and Appendix A of the final PFI report template is the only part of the report that the PCI SS sees. It is anonymised data that gives PCI SSC insight into the types of data breaches the PFIs respond to, what level of interaction with PCI DSS those entities previously had, and to assist in identifying where breached or potentially breached entities failed to fully adhere to the PCI DSS. So with just a limited amount of time today, I'd like to go straight into the finding we can learn the most from. So the most common PCI DSS requirements cited by PFIs as having caused or contributed to breach, that meaning failure to meet the individual PCI DSS requirements provided, an attacker access or the ability to access cardholder data. So consistent with our finding in previous years, the top 3 PCI DSS requirements cited are, as you can see on the screen in front of you, Requirement 6. So that's develop and maintain secure systems and applications. Requirement 8, identify and authenticate access to system components. And Requirement 11, regularly test security systems and processes. As a note, we've used the wording from the PCI DSS version 3.2.1 here, since that is the current version of the standard that is being cited in current forensic investigations. So, Chris, what are the most common failures you see at Requirement 6 when investigating breaches?
Excellent question, Tracey. As you noticed on the previous slide, Requirement 6 represented 50% of the failures that we have seen as PFIs when it comes to forensic investigations. From our standpoint, we see a couple of major failures, one of them being patching. Systems are not being patched on a regular basis, and the attackers are knowing this, so they'll come in and they'll exploit weak vulnerabilities within the systems itself. This is both at the merchant level and the service provider level. From the service provider level, it's even more detrimental because it's a layered stack. So if the service provider is not patching their systems, it could lead to major exploitations for multiple vendors below that. Other failures we're seeing in Requirement 6 is exposed admin pages. A lot of times when merchants deploy their systems, they'll take the install defaults all methodology, where they may not necessarily need all those bells and whistles, and they forget about them and they just focus on their core set of components that they're installed. Well, these other components that they have forgotten about, the adversaries find these and they exploit them and they gain access to the systems.
That's really helpful, thank you. So still carrying on with requirement 6, what advice do you have for the merchants and service providers that we have here or elsewhere to prevent failures at that requirement?
Absolutely. If I could say one word, and I'm sure you all heard this if you've been to previous PCI community meetings, patching. Patching has always been a big issue for a lot of organizations. They either don't have or maintain the systems to test their patches, so they don't deploy them on a regular basis to their production systems. So patching is a major weakness that we see from investigations.
That's great, thank you. So Chris, what are the most common failures you see at requirement 8 when investigating breaches?
Yeah, thanks, Tracey. So I think when we look at requirement 8, there's something that I see that I refer to as the in-place, not in-place requirement. And I'll describe what that looks like. When we go out and do a forensic investigation, for example, we'll start kind of tracking down how we believe the breach occurred. And usually there's a handful of things we're always looking for. And one of the things that we are always asking organizations that may be victims of a breach is around where they have things like multi-factor authentication. And usually a lot of them will be very quick to say, yep, we've got multi-factor authentication in place. And then the investigation goes through and we quickly find they have it in place here, but not in place here, or in place here, but not there and there. Because in their mind, they were able to rationalize or come up with a reason why maybe they didn't necessarily need it in all those places. And so that's why I say it's kind of the in place, not in place effect, where it's just not done uniformly as it should. And ultimately, what we find is it's trivially easy for a threat actor to get into an environment when multi-factor authentication is not in place in all the places that it should be. Because at that point, I mean, just think about the amount of breaches that we've seen in the media, the amount of credentials that are out there, or just the ease in which, you know, one of the earlier presentations was talking about the human element, the ease in which someone can actually lift someone's credential through, you know, something like a phishing or pretexting attack. You know, we see about 80% of breaches involve the human element. So when you consider that, if you don't have multi-factor authentication in place, that generally becomes an easy avenue into the environment. And that is usually where we see a lot of the failures is it's just not uniformly applied as it should be.
That's great. And just thinking about that human element there, you know, I said instantly a technical fault. I was the technical fault, so I was the human element there. So carrying on, what advice can you give to everyone that you sort of engage with and everybody here today?
Sure, yeah, I think the key piece is uniformity and the need for the controls to be applied everywhere, and then also test it. The importance of actually making sure that it's in place and working as it should be. You know, a lot of times we'll see exceptions that are made and then they're forgotten, and then that usually leads to a hole or a gap that gets exploited. So actually going through and having rigorous testing, rigorous logs and things like that to ensure that nothing gets left by the wayside if you have to make a change, or, you know, challenge your executives if someone says, hey, I don't believe we really need it there. You know, push back, use some examples from the forensic investigations as proof or substance to really try to drive getting that requirement done. I was actually talking with a QSA down on the exhibit hall earlier, and he had said something to me about, you know, it's really interesting to hear the perspective of the PFIs, because on the QSA side, they see the list of requirements and they know what they're supposed to do, but actually seeing the outcome of a failure really helps to drive home the reason why we're doing these things. We're not just doing them because they're requirements and so therefore we have to do them, but there's actually consequences and real fallout if we don't.
And that's really good, sort of the fact that the conversation you had, that you're all from the assessor community, but even the QSAs are really interested in the findings that you guys have. So Ben, I'd like to sort of move on to you if I can, and I'm going to ask you the same question. I'm not going to repeat it really, but the common failures in requirement 11, I think.
Thanks, Tracey. So yeah, effectively in a nutshell, requirement 11 is test. So vulnerability test, penetration test, Wi-Fi test, or test your software hasn't been changed maliciously. So we see the failings sort of following on from what Chris to my right said. Really, we see that the lack of pen testing does not therefore find the vulnerabilities or the out-of-date patches or plugins, or even the the open and public CMS panels, the admin panel or the way to upload malware or web shells. If the merchant or service provider actually did a pen test, they would detect that these vulnerabilities exist and then would prevent the threads that Chris was talking about. And on a similar thread, with the open admin panels, that also is a thread that, with the lack of password protection and the lack of MFA, as Chris to my left said, it always part of the sort of the attack chain. And then one of the other threads that we see, despite it being quite a known and old sort of situation, is things like RDP and SSH being open to the internet, which basically means you're giving a login panel to whoever wants to try and brute force and log in, really. And I'd say more prevalent and probably moving forward, the other thread really is the ability to change payment page code. Once the previous two sort of attacks happen, the hackers get to the payment pages to install the fake payment page or JavaScript or pull data from other locations. And the lack of file integrity monitoring on those critical pages is what then enables the hack to occur undetected.
That's great, thank you. And you're probably going to recognise there's a bit of a theme, so I'm going to ask you some advice now, please. What you could give to the audience, the merchants, the service providers, in respect to requirement 11.
Yeah, so I suppose the first and most obvious one is do what it says on the tin. Requirement 11 says test. Well, there's a reason. As Chris said, there are reasons why it says test, because you then find all the other issues that if you didn't, you wouldn't find. It's pretty clues in the title. But the fact is, by doing these tests and also considering doing them more regularly than annually or after a change, you can do them more regularly because you limit the window of which the issue happens to when you rectify it. So it's a baseline guide, isn't it, in that respect? The other things, again, as we've sort of said, is hide your admin panels, lock them down to your known IPs, do it via a VPN or your office IP, or just something that basically shows that it's linked to you and only you know where it is. The other point really on the file integrity monitoring on critical pages on a website is install it, monitor it, and then if you do get alerts, you need someone at the other end to actually act on those alerts. I'm sure the guys to my left and right would have seen that people have systems, the systems do their job, and again the humans then don't actually utilize those systems to enact the whole sort of premise behind it.
That's great, thanks. So there's a common theme there, isn't there? It's about patching, testing. It's about making sure that we're keeping up with what we should be doing and not just letting it fall by the wayside. So wrapping up, I'll pose one last question to all three of you, if I may. What threats do you predict will be prevalent going forwards? And I'm going to give that first to Chris Hague.
Great. So adversaries, they are getting smarter every day. Their tradecraft is being improved every day. The old adage is that you all have to get it right every day, whereas they only need to get it right once to allow access. So I think from our standpoint, and I'm sure these other gentlemen will agree, we're going to see more stealthier type attacks, longer attacks where they're in the network. Sorry to display doom and gloom, but that's pretty much how we're going to see it in the future. Gone are the days of the script kiddies.
Great, thank you. Some good words there. Chris, can I ask you the same question, please?
Sure. So I think exactly what Chris Hague said. I think we're going to continue to see sophistication. We also see a lot of turmoil on the geopolitical stage, which is giving rise to lots of other types of threat vector evolution and innovation. And one of the things for anyone who's been a big reader of our data breach investigations report, one of the things you'll always see as a common takeaway from that is typically one of the biggest motivating factors behind the majority of all the breaches we see is that the threat actors are after financial gain. They're looking for something that they can steal and readily and easily monetize. And cash obviously would be the best for them. The next closest thing is going to be something like payment card data. So it's always going to be top of mind for the criminal groups in terms of what they're going to be going after. And so I believe that we're going to continue to see evolution of and persistence in their attack strategies. And so obviously all that much more important that we continue to focus on, meeting all those requirements. As Chris mentioned, we have to be solid and secure all the time. They only have to be right once, and we know that the motivation is continuing to drive them, after these kinds of sensitive data assets.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. And Ben, last but not least.
Yeah, so one of the issues I will foresee really is the third-party risk. It's not a new issue. It's been around since we started doing this. But as more and more merchants sort of move away to outsourcing some of their sort of responsibilities of the actual execution of this, it's going to go to more third parties. And then, as a hacker, I would target one third party to hack hundreds or millions of merchants, not trying to target individual merchants one by one, because as Jim said earlier, the hackers work smarter, not harder as well. The threads there really are, trying to be addressed in version 4 with sort of sub-resource integrity and content security policies, things like that, where, certainly for websites anyway, where you're not trusting those third parties. So do your due diligence on them before you employ them, and also back to my thread of testing. I would say the other thing to consider with how the world is going with the economy and things is possibly insider threats may increase. As the technology increases, it becomes harder to break that, and the human then becomes more of a target. And we were talking yesterday at the PFI meeting where we're starting to see more insider threat cases where people at all different levels are being targeted or bribed to do things really that they shouldn't do.
So thank you. There's some really good insights there, gentlemen. Thank you for that. But it's your knowledge and also your predictions of where we're going to move. I think the common thread of insider threats is something we've really picked up on, particularly in the PFI session and throughout this event. So thank you very much. It's been very useful. I hope that the audience has been able to find it useful too. And that concludes this panel discussion on preventing data breaches. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.